Hello, everybody, and welcome to our seventh and penultimate event of this season of the Sartorial Society series. My name is Serena Dyer, and I am one of the co-organisers of this series. I'll be chairing tonight's papers along with Liz Gurnard, and we are joined by the other members of the Sartorial Society team, Bethan Bide, Lucy Whitmore, and Liz Tregenza. Tonight, our theme is illustrating bodies, and we have papers from Holly Fletcher and Dolla Merrillees. So before we start, we'd like to thank the Passold Research Fund for their continued support of this series, which allows us to reach a much larger audience. And a few notes of housekeeping. As usual, your microphones and cameras are turned off. However, if you would like to ask a question for either of our speakers, then please do use the Q&A function, which you'll see at the bottom of your screen. You can do this at any time during the talk, so as soon as a question pops in your head, just pop it into the Q&A. If you have any technical issues, then please do reach out on Twitter or our Gmail account, and we'll try and assist you as best that we can. And as usual, please do join in the conversation on Twitter, tag us in, or use our hashtag, which is #Sartorial Society. And also, thank you to everybody that has submitted an abstract for our third season, looking back the historicisms, hauntings, and heritage of dress. We hope to announce the programme at next week's event. So tonight, we have two fantastic 20-minute papers lined up, and I'll now hand over to Liz to introduce our first speaker.
Thanks, Anna. Our first speaker this evening is Holly Fletcher. Holly recently completed her PhD in history at the University of Cambridge, where she was supervised by Professor Ulrike Rublack. Her thesis was titled Body Weight and Shape in Early Modern Germany, circa 1480 to 1620. So congratulations, Holly, on completing during the pandemic. She is currently teaching at the University of Sussex. Her first article, Age, Gender and the Body in the Bronze and Pierwood Statuettes of 1520s Germany, was published by Gender and History earlier this year. And her paper tonight is entitled Fatness and Fashion, the Dressed Experience of Body Weight in Early Modern Germany. So over to you, Holly.
Thank you very much, Liz, for that introduction. It's a real pleasure to be able to share some of my research with you all this evening, and I'm looking forward to hearing all the questions and feedback at the end of the session. So if I just share my screen. Okay, so as Liz mentioned, the research that I'm presenting in this paper comes from my wider PhD project, which examines the cultural significance of body weight in early modern Germany, or the German-speaking regions, predominantly in the 16th century. So I want to begin today by talking a bit more about this wider investigation of body weight in order to then highlight the crucial role that human stories of dress play in my broader analysis. And my investigation of this topic has really been grounded in the personal experience of dress and embodiment from the outset. My interest in body weight began with this man, Matthias Schwarz. And Schwarz has become well known among early modern historians for producing his little book of clothes, also termed the first book of fashion by Ulrike Rublack and Maria Haywood. For anyone who isn't familiar with this really amazing source, Schwarz created the book between 1520 and 1560, during which time he collaborated with several artists to document his clothing from infancy to the age of 63. Above each image, he provided a description of the outfit and often the context in which he wore it. In this image from 1525, for instance, we see Schwarz wearing a grey damask doublet with a wide square neckline, revealing a pleated linen shirt beneath. His sleeves are very full and lightly padded, and his waist is defined. He wears colourful slashed hose with alternating colours of violet, yellow, and white. And above the image, Schwarz writes that he wore this outfit to a friend's wedding. He notes that his hat was embroidered with velvet, and then he writes, "This was when I began to be fat and round." And this section of the text appears smaller, just in this corner here. perhaps being added at a later date, suggesting that Schwarz may have gone back to highlight what he saw as this turning point in his body's size and shape. A year after this portrait, in 1526, and at the age of 29 and a half, Schwarz infamously posed nude for 2 watercolor paintings of his naked body, providing the viewer with an insight into how his body looked beneath the clothes which were the subject of his book. Above the first image, Schwarz writes, "This was my proper figure from behind, for I had become fat and wide, or round." In these images, Schwarz's body contrasts with his usual form-fitting dress, and he does not shy away from presenting a soft fleshiness to his figure. Though not appearing excessively fat, his large thighs and lumpy torso appear as evidence of his professed fatness. His waist is clearly not the trim 60 centimeters of which he had previously boasted. Together with his inscription, the paintings thus indicate an intense awareness of the changing size and form of Schwarz's body. And this is conceived in relation to dress through the placing of these images within his little book of clothes. So encountering these images for the first time as an undergraduate, I was fascinated by Schwarz's description of himself as being fat. The size and shape of his body, clearly held meaning for Schwarz, and his intense awareness of this fatness challenged my prior belief that concern with body weight and shape, fatness and thinness was reserved for the modern age. I'd previously accepted the common view that fatness, if considered at all in past societies, would have been viewed as a positive sign of wealth and prosperity, showing that one could afford enough food at a time when hunger was the norm. And numerous scholars have agreed with this view. For instance, Peter Stearns has written that concern with weight and dieting is not timeless, its origins are modern. Yet the case of Matthias Schwarz challenges this understanding. Not only is he distinctly aware of his size and shape, but he does not appear to view this fattening of his body in a particularly positive way at all. Rather, Schwarz appears concerned at the changes he observes in his body, seeming disconcerted by his aging figure and expressing anxiety about the loss of his younger form. Schwarz thus presents us then with the bigger question of how body weight and shape was understood in the early modern period and in 16th century Germany specifically. Beyond Schwarz, what did it mean to be fat in this period? How was weight experienced? And what cultural meanings did it hold? And these were the questions that were the starting point for my research, and I found that the significance of body weight in early modern Europe had mostly gone unexplored. Several historians have considered early modern understandings of fatness, yet this is generally part of sweeping surveys which cover vast time periods from antiquity to the present day. These works thus offer a broad overview of fatness in early modernity, but this differs from my own approach in several ways. Perhaps most significantly, my emphasis is not just on fat or fatness. So in my research, I use the term body weight, not to indicate a measure of heaviness, as the weighing of bodies was not common in this period, but rather body weight is used more in line with modern conceptions of the term, so denoting the size of the body with reference to how fat or thin it might be considered. I've chosen not to focus solely on fatness and thinness, as my research is not just interested in extremes of body size, but rather in the size and shape of the body more generally. My approach is also distinct from most existing studies through its focus on materiality. As Lyndall Roper persuasively argued in Oedipus and the Devil, bodies are not merely the creation of discourse, but bodies have materiality, and this too must have its place in history. And I suggest that body weight in particular emphasizes the need to consider the materiality of the body beyond discourse. So just as scholars of dress have emphasized the role of clothing in shaping the wearer's visual and physical access to the world, the material size and shape of a person's body has a similar effect. The physical reality of body size influences how a person moves in the world, how they experience space, and how they hold and present themselves in different settings. And I know that a friend of this series, Freya Gowley, is also doing some really exciting research on fat in 18th and 19th century Britain, which I'm really excited to see how that project unfolds. Since the body was the medium through which early modern people experienced the world, we have to recognize then that this experience was itself molded by the feeling of living in a uniquely formed body. And this emphasis on individuality, I think, is important here. And this is where the human stories about dress come in. We recognize that every modern body is different, that even if we all ate the same foods and exercised in the same way, our bodies would not all look the same. Whilst they share the same basic human form, we know that bodies come in various sizes and shapes. While scholars have argued for the need to consider the material differences between historical and modern bodies, we must also consider the differences between bodies in the past. In my exploration of body weight, I've sought to uncover stories about the personal experience of the individually formed body, including those concerning clothing and dress. Using self-narratives such as Schwarz's, I've sought out instances in which early modern protagonists wrote about their experience of the body in relation to dress, to see what this can tell us about the material experience of body weight in this period. I also consider instances at which fashionable bodily ideals were confronted with the material realities of individual bodies, which did not conform to prescribed silhouettes. Just as historians of body weight have tended to approach the topic as a modern concern, though, the impact of clothing and fashion on ideas about body size and shape has similarly been seen as a contemporary trend. Yet with early modern clothing being measured, cut, and fitted on and for particular bodies, I suggest that the awareness of personal bodily size in relation to clothing would have been just as prominent, if not more so, in this period. So to understand what could be a very personal relationship between the body and clothing, we can look at the case study of Hermann von Weinsberg, a Cologne townsman who documented his life in his memory books, written over a period of more than 50 years and across 3 separate volumes. Throughout the volumes, Weinsberg appears particularly aware of his own body, noting its specific measurements over time, and thus how it changed and developed with his increasing age. This awareness was intensified by his experience of living with a hernia, which he described as being the size of an egg. He described using a girdle to support and hide the lump, and the restriction of the girdle, he claims, caused him to become slender in my lower body as though I were totally thin. Here, Weinsberg describes how this garment has materially impacted on his body, permanently altering its form, a fact about which he was particularly resentful, stating, "And this I have to wear for as long as I live." The hernia and its resulting thinness took effect in Weinsberg's clothing choices. Following the revelation of what he terms his defect, he stated that, "For this reason, I have rarely gone around in a doublet and hose, and from the age of 30, I wore a samarie as a tunic instead of shorter styles or the paltrock." Weinsberg himself describes the samarie as being like a wide sack around the body, and this loose-fitting style contrasted with the paltrock, a garment which was cut and fitted to the body and had a clearly defined waist. So I've just included these images to give a sense of the different styles. In choosing to wear the samarie instead of the paltrock then, Weinsberg indicates a desire to conceal his figure, as he prefers to wear clothing which is longer and not fitted to the body, instead choosing garments which will skim over his frame. Here, the interaction of body and girdle has physical consequences for Weinsberg's bodily form and size, which in turn impacts on his fashion choices. Weinsberg's desire to then conceal his thin body was likely grounded in contemporary ideals for the male silhouette in Germany in this period. At the end of the 15th century, the fashionable male figure was depicted as slender, with long, thin legs, which were accentuated through high waistlines and pointed shoes. In the first half of the 16th century, however, the fashionable male silhouette expanded, shoulders broadened, and the entire upper body presented a wide, imposing figure. The idealization of slender bodies continued to an extent, as we see in images of Matthias Schwarz, but this was typically reserved for young and unmarried men. Weinsberg's wearing of looser styles from the age of 30 thus aligns with the fashionable ideal for more mature men. In addition to the loose-fitting, broad-shouldered gowns which were used to create this image of breadth, volume would be added to the male figure in this period through the quilting and padding of tighter-fitting items. In the second half of the 16th century, the padding of male doublets took on a particular form, becoming focused on the belly. This was missed a slide there, just to give more examples of this broad-shouldered silhouette. So this kind of garment was known as a peas belly or peascod in English and referred to as a Gänsbauch in German. Through its padding and structuring, it created an enlarged and rounded stomach. In the Germanisches Nationalmuseum in Nuremberg, an extant green doublet displays one such Gänsbauch. This was created by padding the front and sides of the doublet with cotton fleece, which was laid on a foundation of white linen and stitched into position. A very similar, though child-sized doublet may be seen in a portrait of Balthasar Baumgartner from 1589. Here, the little boy is shown with his belly protruding and curving under in the classic shape of the Gänsbauch. And writing of this constructed bodily form in relation to contemporary plate armor, as we see here, Angus Patterson has written that this impression of a full and swollen belly is suggestive of a well-fed gentleman. He suggests, therefore, that the purpose of the Gänsbauch was to present an image of fatness and wealth. And on one level, this presentation of a large stomach may have been associated with such ideas of prosperity and access to rich foods. Yet these positive connotations of fatness existed in tension with those which connected the fat belly to the sins of gluttony and drunkenness in this period, as we see in these prints from Hans Weiditz. These negative associations informed contemporary criticism of the Gänsbauch. In England, Philip Stubbs wrote in his Anatomy of Abuses that I never saw any wear them, but I have supposed him to be a man inclined to gourmandize, gluttony, and such like. Lutheran pastor Lucas Osiander similarly criticized the Gänsbauch in a sermon from 1586, stating, "If one who wears one such fabricated belly gained one such belly in reality, as that with which he wants to fill out his clothes, he would plead at several altars for God to remove this burden and cross from him. Yet when we form this stomach ourselves with clothing, it is supposed to be a special prosperity." Whilst wearers might indicate their prosperity through these padded stomachs, therefore, Osiander suggests that this is not meant to be a reflection of the body beneath. Such men would not want others to believe that their actual bellies were round and bloated. The acceptability of the Gänsbauch for its wearers might then rest on an acknowledged disconnection with the form of the actual body, complicating the idea that such men wished to appear well-fed. Indeed, in many of the portraits which depict men wearing such false bellies, the pointed form of the Gänsbauch actually accentuates a narrow waist. Such images show very slim young men wearing the garment, and it is their thinness that enables the Gänsbauch to stand out from their slender figures. The green doublet mentioned earlier indicates that larger men did wear these items, yet even in portraits where the sitter appears to have a relatively large body, the Gänsbauch acts to narrow the waist. Were a man to have an actual protruding belly, this would make such cinching in difficult, creating an expanse around the waist which would not fit with the fashionable silhouette intended. So unfortunately, I haven't found a specific instance of a person talking about this material experience of wearing the Gänsbauch, but I've included this discussion because I think it's a good example of the need to think about how particular garments interacted with the material and individual human body. We see here how cultural ideals come up against physical realities and how each could inform one another. Rather than demonstrating wealth by presenting the wearer as well-fed, the Gensbauch appears rather to demonstrate that the body beneath the garment is slender enough to allow this padded belly to sit in the correct position on the body. Osiander's statement then supports this notion, suggesting that such men would not want to be thought of as having actual fat bodies in reality. The personal bodily forms of men, of course, would typically be far more consistent than those of women, who in 16th century Germany were pregnant on average every other year. Their bodies would thus alter in cycles, expanding and contracting regularly. And they would also experience the long-term impact of such pregnancies on their bodily size and shape. Turning to another human story of body weight from this period, we see how dress shaped the experience of the expanding pregnant body. In 1584, Magdalena Paumgartner wrote to her husband to complain about her body's expanding size during her pregnancy with her son, little Balthasar, who we encountered earlier. She asked her husband, also called Balthasar, to send her 4 measures of damask so that she could make a loose garment for herself, which she writes, "I have never liked wearing before, but now I have to do it. When I go out, I can't do up my bodice, and I have let it out as far as I can. If I were even just a little fatter, I'd suffocate from it, which I don't want to do. I wanted to conceal myself with a gown for a while. Another time I'll get away from you, dearest love, so that what's happening to me now won't happen again." With this statement, we see the way in which this change in her size is measured and experienced by Magdalena in relation to the tightness of her dress. In reaction, she hopes to conceal her body under a garment that she does not enjoy wearing, suggesting that she finds the enlargement of her body not only unattractive, but also an unpleasant experience. This is confirmed in her final sentence, where she insists that she will get away from Balthasar should an occasion arise in which she might become pregnant again. And indeed, she never did have another child. Her dislike of being pregnant, which appears to be predominantly based on the experience of her expanding body, reminds us then of the subjective material experience of bodily size. Given that this enlarged state could be expected for the majority of women every other year, Magdalena's statement suggests that it is not in relation to the norms or ideals of society that she dislikes her expanded form. Rather, it is her own bodily experience of pregnancy, which she associates with the increasing tightness of her clothing, as well as being forced to wear clothes she would not otherwise want to wear, which has made her dislike this largeness of her body. So through this glimpse into my research on dress and body weight, I've sought to present the critical role of personal human stories of dress in approaching the materiality of body weight in this period. As we've seen, ideal silhouettes could not simply be imposed on the body, but could only work within its material constraints. If one's body was too large, for instance, items like the Gensbauch would not create their intended effect. If one was too thin, they might not fill out their clothes in the way they would like, instead choosing to conceal the body in the manner of Weinsberg. Individuals would make clothing choices that reflected the reality of their bodies and were not simply based on fashionable or favoured forms, as in the case of Magdalena. Cultural ideals, therefore, came up against individual subjectivities and personal bodily realities. And I suggest that these moments of intersection are best explored through human stories of the dressed experience of body weight. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Holly. That was fascinating. And I'm sure that our audience is bursting with questions. So if you have any, then please do submit them into the Q&A function at any time, and we will answer them at the end. So our second speaker tonight is Dolla Merrillees, who is joining us from Australia, where it is the early hours of the morning. So we are extremely grateful and lucky to have her with us. So Dolla is a curator, independent researcher and author. She was former director of the Museum of Applied Arts and Sciences in Australia, where she spearheaded the establishment of the museum's Centre for Fashion, the first such centre of excellence in an Australian cultural institution. And she developed a programme of fashion exhibitions, including A Fine Possession, Jewellery and Identity in 2014, Collect Dinnigan Unlaced in 2015, and Love Is Australian Wedding Fashion in 2017. Dolla's paper tonight is entitled From Isfahan to London. So over to you, Dolla.
Sorry, thank you very much. My thanks to the Sartorial Society for the opportunity to tell this deeply personal, untold story. And to Holly, thank you for such a fascinating talk. So I'll just share my screen. All right. Parveen Helen Merrillees' death in November of 2019 was not unexpected. It had been a long, slow decline, but it was nonetheless shocking in its finality. She died in the Centre Hospitalier in Auxerre, a Burgundian city on the Yonne River. And she died in a room on the second floor, a room of pale blue walls and jaundiced yellow flooring, and a view dominated in the distance by a cold grey sky and the Gothic Cathedral of Saint-Étienne. It was a room profoundly and deeply disconnected from the rich, complex tapestry of her life. Dementia had ravaged this beautiful, sometimes fierce, sometimes acerbic and fragile woman with whom I had a loving but complicated relationship. She was my mother. Over the past few years, I'd watched as she'd become more anxious and fearful about losing her memory, her features becoming a bit more blurred, her eyes unfocused, flitting, never quite settling, as if she was trying to chase the elusive thoughts that were slowly seeping out of her. She had spent the last 20 years of her life living in a quiet and unassuming village in rural France with her husband of 55 years, my father, Robert Merrillees. It was a far cry from their urbane, itinerant lives as diplomats and archaeologists, with time served in Cambodia as Pol Pot was beginning to come to power, in Beirut during the Civil War, and in Israel during the First Intifada. Parveen never really got beyond her rudimentary schoolgirl French. She always felt that the French should learn to speak English, but the village welcomed and absorbed her into the rhythm of its daily life. If they ever wondered why two such conspicuous foreigners should choose to settle in this remote and rural part of France, they never asked. In the days after my mother's funeral, my sister and I hesitantly sorted through her possessions. My mother had always been very organized, her jumpers color-coded and in baskets, her shoes and bags in drawstring dust-proof pouches, and her jewelry methodically arranged into sets, amethyst, blushing pink coral, cubic zirconia, amber and garnet. She had chronicled all of our family photographs into albums arranged by year and country, and her papers were filed in manila folders by subject, held in a long, low trunk in the attic, and amongst these papers was a folder of drawings. Sorry, that didn't seem to have... Sorry, can you just excuse me a second while I try and sort out why it's not moving?
Dolla, if you click on the little arrows at the bottom, it should that should hopefully let it move rather than.
So I have, hold on, I'll stop the share and just try again. Any suggestions?
If you open, are you looking at it on Zoom or are you looking at your PowerPoint?
Ah, it's done it.
Perfect.
Great, sorry about that. As I said, amongst her papers, we found a folder of her drawings. Small scale, imperfectly drawn pencil sketches on cream card or lined paper, a little soiled and discolored, some with dog-eared creases and tears in the corners. Beguiling, intimate, personal, and charming. These were portraits, life drawings, line drawings, and quick gestural fashion illustrations far removed from the slick photoshopped perfection that we see today in glossy magazine editorials such as Vogue, Elle, or Harper's Bazaar. Over the next few months, I found myself repeatedly returning to them, picking them up and turning them over in my hands, smoothing the creases and tracing the pencil lines with my fingertips as if I could absorb them. It's not that they were unfamiliar. We had grown up with them, and my sister had a set framed and hanging in our hallway. But in thinking about the loving, sometimes fractious relationship I had with my mother, I realized that they represented a woman I had forgotten, or at least had repressed under the weight of her illness. The drawings had always been there, but perhaps now, because my mother was dead, they were a tactile, physical reminder of the person she had been, a person I missed. They are a legacy both personal and familial, and I wondered why, despite my parents' peripatetic lifestyle, when so much was discarded and lost as they moved from country to country, that these drawings were never thrown away. Did they remind my mother of the young woman she had been at the cusp of adulthood? Were these the drawings of dreams, longing, hope, and ambition? I was not as patient as I could have been during her illness, and perhaps through guilt, I wanted to find a way to reconnect to her. I didn't want my memories of her to be the half-life she had been leading. I wanted to remember the vibrant, funny, and dignified woman who had so captivated my father all those years ago. The drawings that sit in my study and that I look at every day would help me to unravel her story. As a curator and writer, I've had some experience and research, but the drawings weren't giving much away. While some were dated, most weren't, and there was no indication of her sources, although we knew anecdotally that she drew inspiration from English and French newspapers of the late 1940s and early 1950s. It was also not clear whether she had simply copied fashion plates or whether she had taken artistic liberties with the designs. In piecing together her own mother's life, writer and feminist Anne Summers noted in her book, The Lost Mother, I had learnt to gather together fragments of information and assemble them into coherent stories. It was the kind of history writing that women had to invent when in the 1970s, we realized that most women's stories could not be found in the official records, and so other sources had to be explored. My mother's story is also not in the official records, but I was extremely lucky that she had written her memoirs some years previously. Memoirs are written for many different reasons, as a means of preserving a family's legacy, to gain insight into the past, a search for personal identity, or to heal from a traumatic experience. My mother's memoirs were all of that and more, and in her acknowledgements, she wrote that in a way it has helped me to try and understand my mum and dad and the context of their lives, which made them what they were. The memoir focuses on the period between 1932 and 1963, the year she was born to the year she met my father, after which she claimed as her happy ever after, a part of her life that she didn't feel the need to record. She was not a confident writer, and her account is not really a nostalgic trip down memory lane, but there's a sense of wistfulness, of lingering pain, a yearning for her parents' love and approval, and a determination to make something of herself, to follow her interests and to learn. And as I reread through it, I wondered how much of the period she wrote about had dominated her life and how much she had let it dominate her. Parveen is the Persian name of the Pleiades star constellation, but my mother preferred to be known as Helen, her second name. She was worried people would shorten her first name to Parv, which she hated. And so she became, as one boyfriend called her, La Belle Hélène, with a face that launched 1,000 ships. She was born in Isfahan in April of 1932 to an Irish Catholic mother, Dorothy Leahy, and an Iranian Muslim father, Hassan Razavi. Her parents had met in Manchester in 1923, where my grandfather lived as a lodger at Dorothy's parents' boarding house. He had traveled from Bandar Abbas on the southern coast of Iran to England to work as an import-export agent. And in his unpublished memoirs, he describes his initial impressions of Dorothy as a young lady with a pale face and blue eyes, who was fascinated to see what a Persian looked like, and was surprised to note that I was not behaving like a wild man from the mountains, and that the only information they had about Persia was its long-haired cats. They married in 1929 at St. Joseph's Catholic Chapel, and it's worth noting how unusual an interfaith marriage must have been at that time. They lived in England a year or two before returning to live in Iran. And while this is not my grandmother's story, one can only imagine what it must have been like for a young woman who had never traveled outside of England to set up a house in Tehran. My grandfather perhaps best describes it when he writes, "There were many surprises in store for my wife. There was no piped water, no gas, no electricity, and less than inadequate sanitary facilities. She had never experienced such heat or the appalling conditions under which she had to live. She bore it all bravely." Fortunately, their time in Tehran was short-lived and they moved to Isfahan, where my grandfather had accepted a new job with the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. And it was there amongst the golden domed mosques and fragrant rose gardens that Parveen was born. At the end of the 2 years, they relocated to Hamadan in Western Iran, where my grandfather had been promoted to area manager. My mother loved Hamadan's mountainous landscapes, the snow and rushing clouds, and her childhood memories of this period are a happy one. She remembers being taught to make tadig, the beautiful pan-fried Persian rice, watching Walt Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs at the local cinema, speaking Farsi with her nanny, as well as learning to draw and paint. Her peaceful life in Iran came to an end, however, with the outbreak of the Second World War. She remembers being at school during one of their drawing and painting sessions and hearing an English voice on the radio announcing that England had declared war on Germany. It was September the 3rd, 1939. With Iran opting to remain neutral, the impact of a war was not felt until August of 1941, when the English entered Iran from the south and the Russians from the north. The purpose of the Anglo-Soviet invasion and occupation was ostensibly to ensure the safety of the Allied supplied lines to the USSR, secure Iranian oil fields, and limit German influence in the country. In the fear and confusion that followed, my grandparents decided that my grandmother and the children, my mother and her younger brother, would temporarily relocate to Karachi until the situation became clearer. It was a move that was to have profound consequences on my mother's life. In her memoirs, my mother writes almost dispassionately about the separation from their father, their overland journey from Hamadan to Basra, their passage to Karachi by seaplane over the Arabian Sea, and being taken in by a sympathetic Irish nun as refugees at the Daughters of the Cross of St. Joseph's Convent School. They remained there for 2 years, and while she describes it as a time when she left behind her childhood, the smells, the heat, the vibrant colors and diverse mix of people imprinted itself indelibly in her mind. She was a keen observer of the people and life around her, both in the convent and on outings, recalling the delectable looking sweets being sold by impoverished hawkers outside the convent school gates, the lovely rose-colored full-skirted dress and veil of a teacher who was getting married, the slightly askew green beret she wore to Sunday church, and the tall, gentle-mannered Indian tailor who made stylish dresses from swathes of Persian silk for her mother, thinking she would cut a dash when she returned to Iran. And the drawing on the right is the only drawing that my mother did of her mother, Dolly. Although airmail letters were exchanged regularly with Hassan, there was no suggestion that they returned to Iran, rather the opposite, and quite suddenly arrangements were being made for their passage by sea to England. By then, Parveen was getting on for 12 years old, and with her pigtails and unsightly thick bottle glasses, she was beginning to sense that she was, as she put it, slightly off. She remembers her mother not being properly received by members of the British community, of whom there were quite a number in Karachi, speculating that it was perhaps because of Hassan's nationality. It was an indication of what they might face when they arrived in England. One dark evening in the August of 1943, after a 3-month journey by Colombo, Port Said and Gibraltar, they disembarked in Liverpool. My mother was shocked. She had expected picturesque green fields, not this disappointing, sad and drab place. It didn't take her long to realize that they were about to embark on a very new and different life. A life of enforced blackouts and bombing raids, as well as unprecedented government intervention into almost every aspect of daily life. A life where food and clothing were in short supply, leading the novelist Barbara Cartland to lament in 1944 that everything was rationed except perhaps love. A very different life that didn't include a father. That same night, they boarded a train to Golders Green, where my mother's brother had rented a house for them to live. When I asked my mother about her memories of the war, she invariably spoke about the doodlebugs and the noise of the planes, guns, and bombs. Foremost in her mind were these myriad of flashes in the sky, the siren warnings, and hiding in the space under the stairs. As Stanley Baldwin told the House of Commons, I think it is well also for the man in the street to realize that there is no power on earth that can protect him from being bombed. The bomber will always get through. But her memories were not necessarily unhappy. She remembers learning to dance, inspired by Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, listening to the Children's Hour on the radio and avidly reading Girl's Own, which she described as very girlish with incipient romances. Every Saturday morning when they were able, they went to the movies, with films based on 1001 Nights being particular favourites. And throughout, she continued to draw and sketch, especially fashion looks. By this time, clothing rationing had been in place in Britain for more than 3 years. And as the historian Julie Summers bluntly describes it, it was a dreary time. Wardrobes had to be functional, flexible, and durable, and the Make Do and Mend scheme designed to encourage people to revive and repair worn-out clothes was no longer just a campaign, but a tiresome necessity. Even Vogue's fashion editors conceded that fashion has slowed into the tempo of a steady marriage. That's the way it is, and there's no doubt that's the way it has to be for the duration. And while I don't ever recall my mother mentioning it, it would be hard to imagine that she wasn't aware of the utility clothing scheme, which ran from 1942 to 1949. Initiated by the Board of Trade, it was designed to save on material and labour for the war effort. And while there was some initial resistance by consumers, an inspired decision was made to recruit a group of Britain's most renowned couturiers, the Incorporated Society of London Fashion Designers, to produce stylish designs for the mass production of clothes. The society included, amongst others, Norman Hartnell, Digby Morton, Hardy Amies, and Bianca Mosca. And while the concept of designers producing for the mass market fashion is taken for granted today, it's easy to forget, as Julie Summers writes, that it originated in a time of austerity over 3/4 of a century ago. The end of the war saw my mother, her brother, and my grandmother living in straitened circumstances in a one-room basement flat in Hove. Financial constraints had seen them move out of London, and it was clear by then that they would not be returning to Iran. The marriage was over. Although divorce and legal separation was becoming more widespread, it remained uncommon enough to be a potential source of shame. And Dorothy, embarrassed about the breakdown of her marriage, grew increasingly depressed, isolating herself from her Irish family. This period overshadowed my mother's life, and as a sensitive and diffident young woman, she was acutely aware of Dorothy's sadness and distress. My mother at this stage was in her final years of school at the Convent of the Sacred Heart in Hove. Tall, gangly, and self-conscious, she felt like a fish out of water. The stigma of coming from a broken family, compounded by her foreign-sounding name and looks, meant that she was often subject to subtle forms of bigotry. While my mother would not necessarily have seen herself as the victim of covert and systemic racism, there is no doubt in my mind that it had a damaging effect on her, and she never forgot being told by one of the nuns that she wouldn't go very far. With little money, and like many other people at the time, my mother and grandmother made many of their own clothes, laying out the paper pattern pieces on the floor, cutting the material, tacking, hemming, and machine sewing. And it's quite possible that some of my mother's inspiration from her illustrations came from the Vogue, Butterick, and Simplicity design sketches. She avidly read magazines and spent hours copying the fashionable new styles disseminated through newspapers and advertisements, particularly Dior's new look with its clinched waists, blossoming bosoms, and full skirts. Amongst her drawings, we found a clipping she used as a reference, perhaps torn from the Brighton and Hove Herald. She may also have fallen under the spell of the theatrical sets and dolls of a Théâtre de la Mode, which toured Paris, London, and the United States, showcasing the savoir-faire of the French haute couture during the post-war era. And it wasn't only contemporary fashion that captured her imagination. Amongst her books, we found a copy of Iris Brooks and James Laver's English Costume from the 14th through to the 19th century, published in 1937. While James Laver was a noted dress historian and curator at London's Victoria and Albert Museum, I haven't really been able to find out much about Iris Brooke, another overlooked fashion illustrator whose story is waiting to be told. My mother's costume sketches are amongst my favorite, not just because of their whimsy, but because I always picture her in my head lying on the floor, frowning in concentration, her reference books open beside her as she mixes her watercolors to get the right shade of red or brown. How much my mother knew about fashion illustration and fashion design, I'm not sure, but she was fascinated with dress and costumes. And as a child, I remember her introducing me to Serge Diaghiliev's Ballet Russe and the exotic drawings by Léon Basque and Georges Barbier. Given her own background, she was always drawn to Oriental aesthetics, themes and subjects with artists such as John Frederick Lewis and Jean-Léon Gérôme, and designers Paul Poiret and Mariano Fortuny amongst her favorites. Wherever possible, we visited fashion exhibitions together, and she particularly adored the mix of influences and artistry in the exhibition devoted to Jean Lanvin that we saw at Palais Galeria in Paris in 2015. I visited Paris many times with my parents, but it was only as I was rereading my mother's memoirs that I realized her first extended trip to the city had been in the May of 1951, when she was 19 years old. During her gap year and before she started her training as a Nightingale nurse at St. Thomas's Hospital in London, she spent a month staying at the Sacred Heart Convent in Montmartre. Ostensibly there to improve her French, she walked around everywhere, dazzled by the expensive shops and department stores, as well as visiting museums and galleries. Her mother had made some new clothes for her to wear, including an outfit of dark red tartan with a pleated skirt and pillbox hat that she wore to a Nina Ricci fashion parade. She spent much of her time sketching fashion looks together with the art that she had seen in the galleries, such as the Louvre's Venus de Milo. As Julie Summer notes, Parisians were relishing their freedom in these first years after the war, with Dior's new look perfectly capturing the drama of the moment. Dior himself was to describe it as a return to an ideal of civilized happiness. For my mother, constrained by Britain's ongoing rationing and austerity, it felt as if a whole world was opening up to her. The drawings she produced during this time are not highly polished, but quick gestural sketches with strong, vibrant colors that convey the essence of the garments and styles. Featuring curvy hourglass silhouettes, she prioritizes the clothes rather than the mannequins' faces, and rarely, if ever, includes a background. They are a deeply personal response, capturing the new look's feminine, curvaceous figures, but also symbolizing return to more cheerful and optimistic times. For a young, independent woman about to embark on the next phase of her life, they hint at the changing social norms and the promise of a brighter future. They tell a story of fashion, but they also tell her story. And I always think of the women in her drawings as being quietly confident, with just a hint of attitude, precursors to the youthful subculture groups that were beginning to question the status quo, leading to the counterculture of the 1960s and 1970s. But they also suggest a deep longing, a yearning to belong and to fit in, to own, and to have nice things. When I started this research, I thought it was about trying to identify the individual dresses and the designers she had sketched. But I realize now that that's not what's important. The more time I spend with the drawings, the more I find myself forgetting her illness, and the frustrations of those last years. And instead, I'm reminded of a woman of fierce loyalties, strong convictions, and great compassion. A woman who made me laugh and shared with me a lifelong love of art and to history, and a deep appreciation for the sartorial aesthetics of the past. A woman who was determined to be educated and against all the odds went on to get her degree in archaeology at University College London. And it was there that she met who she called her other lifelong interest, my father. And I miss the person she had been. Most of my memories of my mother are invariably tied in with what she wore. She was always elegantly, if conservatively dressed. She hated what she called her knobbly knees, and she never wore skirts above her mid-calf. She had a weakness for Dior bags and Jaeger jackets. My father describes her as having a style of her own which time and fashion could never vary. On my most recent trip to France, I asked my father if I could look through her wardrobe. In one of her drawers, I unearthed a multicolored knitted vest in yellows, purples, and browns, very 70s in feel. And I remember her wearing it over a cream blouse paired with a fawn-colored pencil skirt. I packaged it up and sent it to my daughter, who now wears it as a crop top with jeans and Converse sneakers. Well, I think my mother would have had reservations about showing so much skin. I know she would be delighted that her clothes are being given a second life by her granddaughter. In the last years of her life, my mother, with the encouragement of my sister, took up drawing again, taking local evening classes in the village. We hoped it would distract her from her illness and perhaps help with her memory. I'm not sure why she had originally stopped painting and drawing, but I suspect life had got in the way. And when I asked my father, he thought perhaps that she wanted to put that part of her life behind her. It's worth noting that at the time my mother stopped drawing, fashion illustration itself was on the wane. Illustrated covers by artists such as René Robert Boucher, Alfredo Bourret, and Eric Stemp were occasionally featured, but magazine editors were increasingly putting their resources into photography. I am struck, however, as I look at the drawings, as I do every day, that she had kept them throughout the years. And I wonder whether it was to remind her of her dreams and how far she had come. While she was never to draw fashion again, her last pictures were of her beloved mountains in Hamadan. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dolla. That was so fascinating and moving. Really, really enjoyed that. So I am going to take chair's privilege and kick us off with a question of my own, which is also very influenced by my own work and my own interest in the ways in which dress can tell biographical and personal stories. And also, I think, links your two papers nicely. We're always quite pleasantly surprised by the synergies that come out of the pairings that we create. So my question is really about the sense of autobiography that is present in both of your papers. So with Schwartz, Holly, in your paper, and with your mother, Dolla, in your paper. And I wondered if you could both just reflect a little bit on the ways in which you think that dress and visual representations of dress can act as a way into that sense of biography. Either of you can go first.
Yes, so I guess what's been quite fascinating about the exercise of researching my mother's drawings is, I guess, this sort of unexpected rabbit hole that it leads you down, but also this kind of notion of telling life stories through objects. And in this case, obviously my mother's drawings, and I guess discovering that really, while I'm still really interested in who the designers were and where she may have got, copied the illustrations from, there is this wonderful moment of being able to tell the life story, or being able to tell a very physical, in Mum's context, these are the very physical things that I have of hers, that she actually made and drew, which makes them intensely personal in the way that a kind of I guess another object is not. So I am very, very interested in this ability to tell life stories through domestic objects or through the context of objects. I'm not sure if that quite answers the question, but you know, I think it's an area of study that's incredibly fascinating and interesting.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, it's been often quite frustrating in wanting to kind of start more with the garments themselves, because often you don't know for this period who they actually belong to. So that doublet, for instance, I don't think we might have something of a biography in terms of how the garment was acquired, but the actual wearer is unknown. But we do have one case actually of a pair of bodies which were belonged to Dorothea von Neuburg, and they're the only extant example of that kind of sort of structured garment. And I think that is really interesting in the idea that it was her body that kind of was formed in that way, and you get that sense of the personal figure there. But mainly I've had to rely on these kind of stories, which I think can be sort of limiting in a way. But of course, like the Schwarz example is so rich in that you get the images as well, and kind of how he wants his body to be presented, or you know, how he wants his clothing to be presented. And I think that's also why then those nude images are so interesting, because it's almost so honest. Like, why does he feel this need to include these images of himself where he's kind of unsure of himself and feeling like he's gained weight within this collection, which is otherwise quite idealized? So I think that was one of the reasons why I really wanted to look into that. Yeah, again, I'm not sure if I answered the question, but definitely I think that autobiography through dress, although I've had to go mainly through texture, I think it is so interesting.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you to both of you. They're both really fantastic papers. I have a question for Holly about language. Did Schwarz use various terms throughout his journals for fatness, euphemisms, coy, evasive words, or did he always use fat?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Language is a big part of the study as well, and I think the materiality element kind of comes through of not wanting just to focus on language, but also that experience. So Schwarz uses the terms dick and feist. So sort of dick being more like wide or broad, and feist as sort of fat or also stout. And so it's interesting that I think that he uses both terms, almost that one is not enough to kind of signify the changes that he sees. But other terms I've looked at is I find people using Meston, which is like deliberate fattening of animals. So I think that's quite interesting, because it's sort of that intentional fattening of the body through sort of eating particular foods. Yeah, so language has been really important.
Thank you, Holly. That was a really interesting answer. I'm going to go back to you again, Holly, with another question for you. So we have a question that asks about the kind of, I guess, the moral side of body weight, and whether or not you've found sort of positive experiences of fat bodies, as well as the less pleasant experiences that you reflected upon in your paper.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's something that I've kind of, it's sort of that balance, I think, about, and also the sort of personal experience as well, where people like Schwarz, for instance, is not enjoying the sort of fatness of his body, whereas other people express that kind of anxiety about not being fat enough even. So in other self-narratives that I've looked at, I found instances where people have described losing weight and how they want to then kind of re-fatten their bodies, often during periods of travel. So one thing that I have found, that Germans are sort of associated to an extent, a kind of German identity as having these large bodies during this period. And you see that breadth developing in images of men. And it's often associated then with the sort of cold climate of Germany, that they sort of need this bulk. And so when they travel into warmer climates, they're often sort of concerned about losing weight. So I've got letters from husbands writing back to their wives saying that, you know, I've lost weight from all the sweating in Italy and I need to sort of re-fatten myself. So I think that's kind of quite a positive aspect of fat as well, because it's almost that sort of personal relationships can be built through that nurturing of the body and sort of increasing the size and those associations between food and care.
Amazing. I have a question for Dolla that's sort of, I guess, a personal question, in that I'm just wondering, because I know that this is a reflection of my own personal experience of why I became interested in dress history, but were these drawings that you said were around with your childhood, did they influence your, your desire and your career trajectory into going into dress?
No, they didn't. I think actually it was more, I spent, my childhood was very peripatetic. I mean, I moved countries every 3 to 4 years, and my parents were also archaeologists. So I grew up predominantly in the Middle East as well as elsewhere. So my interest in working in, I guess, museums and collections was really actually came from my parents' archaeological background rather than my mother's drawings. But my interest, I guess, in fashion did come from my mother. And I was very fortunate, and I've been very fortunate in my career to have worked with some fairly significant fashion collections. And so I guess my interest has grown from there. And Sydney's Museum of Applied Arts and Sciences has really arguably one of Australia's best fashion collections from both the colonial era, but also contemporary. And I think what I was really interested in there is how much they told a story about, the life of the colony, but also individual stories of people in the Australian context. So I suppose it's been a kind of a progression rather than something deliberate. But I've stayed working very much in that kind of fashion space because I think what's really interested me around fashion is how much it's tied up with identity. And I'm really interested in that aspect of how clothes tell a personal story and a story about identity and how they can function as armor, and how they are about our presentation to the world. So I'm very interested in fashion from that kind of respect.
That's lovely, Dolla. And I think another nice link between both of your papers tonight again. So I have another question for Holly. And this is about, it's actually about 1793 and the belly pads that there was a brief trend for then, which one of our attendees is researching. And their question is really, is this extended belly that we see in the doublets that you're describing, sort of what's unique about that particular occurrence? And do you find other occurrences at other points in the early modern period? What's the sort of the uniqueness versus the repeated occurrence of these kinds of fashions?
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear about the later occurrence of that. It's not something that I was really familiar with. I don't know that I would say that it's necessarily a unique thing in this period. I think the way that I've been approaching it is kind of how we can view that within this particular cultural setting. So kind of what it means in 16th century Germany to have that, given the kind of discourse that is around on the kind of German body and the fat body. So kind of specifically in that setting, which I suppose would make it then unique from later iterations of a similar form. And also I think really that materiality element is what I'm interested in and how the body interacts with that. So I would be interested to hear any more research that's looking at these later forms and how that interacts with the body. That would be really interesting.
A lot of your discussions about the silhouette in terms of visual illusion and making the waist smaller by adding things definitely resonates with my research. But switching back, we've got another question for Dolla, asking, let me start at the beginning, sorry. Some of your mother's illustrations showcased cultural influences of the countries in which she lived, but did her wardrobe contain any, quote, ethnic clothing, or was it mainly Western designers?
No, my mother had an extensive wardrobe, mostly Western designers, but as children we grew up with Persian dress. So I've still got my childhood Persian costume. And my mother had kaftans and other pieces. I'm not sure her fashion sort of style translated into wearing kind of, I guess ethnic dress, but certainly when we were children, we were dressed up, according to where we lived. So when we lived in Cambodia and Vietnam, we wore the ao. And as children, we had the sort of traditional Persian costume. So I guess she was conscious of it from that aspect. And we've got Polaroids from the I'm not going to say my age, somewhere in the 60s, 70s, wearing the ao and things. So it's very interesting to think about that now, having worn those things when we were children, about that kind of context about appropriation and, wearing kind of ethnic dress. So, but she didn't actively acquire clothing from other countries in that respect.
Can I ask a follow-up question? So I'm going to mix up the format. Does she have any, apart from, you showed the drawing of the Arabian Nights from the cinema, but does she draw any dress that isn't sort of Western styles in her illustrations?
Look, no. I mean, my sister and I have sort of gone, the drawings are a bit scattered between sort of France, Australia and England. So we haven't really had a chance to kind of go through them properly. I've got a couple of them, here with me now. No, most of them seem to have been Western. Whether she did others that we haven't found or that she didn't keep, I don't know. The one that's obviously the most obvious one is the one of the sort of the belly dancer. And I know that she was very interested in tales from the Arabian Nights and stuff. Whether she did more drawings of that, I don't know. It'd be lovely to uncover them if she has.
So I am going to ask another question that's for both of you, that again I think picks up on a nice consistency of themes between your papers, and that is about dress and age. So Holly, in your paper you were saying about these sort of younger slender bodies versus these more mature larger bodies, and Dolla, you're dealing with the fashions that your mother was fascinated by when she was younger, and can see that the sort of age, as she advanced in age, there were various parts of life that changed her relationship with fashion. So I wondered if you could both reflect a little bit on that relationship between life cycle and age and dress.
Should I go? Yeah, as you say, that's kind of a real, quite striking element of a lot of the imagery in German dress in this period, where younger men are shown in these very slender figures with the long, thin legs, sort of continuing that more Gothic silhouette from the 15th century, whereas older men are much broader. And also, I think the life cycle point is really interesting, because often it also hinges on marriage. So even if they're younger, sort of in their 20s, if they're married, then they'd be more likely to sort of present that bigger body as well, or wearing clothes that enlarge the body. Whereas for women, actually, it's a lot more consistent, oddly, given that their bodies would be changing more often, or maybe that's sort of the reason why. But German women, sort of almost regardless of age, are often shown with sort of very small, tight upper bodies, and then sort of looser lower bodies. So I have also found, going back to marriage, that often once a couple gets married, in their sort of couples portraits, the woman's body is sort of expanded almost to mirror the man's body, which I think is sort of, it's quite interesting reflection on that relationship and the role of the body within that.
I think what's quite interesting about my mother's drawings, if I kind of look at them, like this one here, she drew very idealized figures, and almost, I guess maybe even aspirational. It's hard to know. And I always found it interesting that the hairstyles of the mannequins that she drew, you know, looked a little bit like like her hair. You know, so I think there was a great aspiration to look and feel that kind of hourglass curvy figure. And, you know, she never drew, the proportions are always very similar in all of her drawings. I mean, there's no drawings of anyone with kind of, you know, who's fat or any different from that kind of body shape. And I think what's interesting with Mum as she got older, and her body shape did not change that much. She was always very proud that she'd sort of maintained her figure as she sort of thought about it. But she, in terms of her dress, she got much more conservative, I think, as she got older. So in the early photographs we have of her, you know, she's wearing sort of crop tops and trousers. But as she got older, and my memories of her are wearing skirts that covered her knees and being much more kind of demure, I guess, in her dress and much more conservative. So she definitely, in a way, sort of got more body conscious, it almost feels like, as she got older.
Great. Thank you so much. I think that is about all we have time for tonight. So I'll just wrap up by saying a very large thank you to both of our speakers and to everyone who's attended. And we will be back next week. So we're correct, next week, for our final event of the series with 3 papers. No, 2 weeks. 2 weeks. Read the wrong thing. Apologies. We'll be back in 2 weeks for our final papers addressing the theme of self-fashioned youth by Mariella, I'm going to apologize, Aguero, Rosie Finley, and Joe Jenkinson. Apologies for every mispronunciation and the wrong date. It's clearly that kind of day. But thank you so much for our speakers, and we look forward to seeing you at the last session.
Thank you.